welcome to this BIAA online lecture. We are very, very happy to have Lorna with us this evening. Your videos and your microphones are turned off by default. And if you need to ask any questions, please use the Q&A box. We'll come to the questions at the end of the talk. And please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box and say hi from where you are joining. And yeah, we are very, very happy to have Lorna to talk about Stonehenge and take us to Stonehenge this evening. I'm going to start with introducing her and then introducing her talk. And then I am going to leave the floor to Lorna's lecture. So Lorna Jane Richardson is a lecturer in Digital Humanities and Heritage in the School of Art, Media and American Studies at the University of East Anglia. Her research and teaching are focused on the intersection of digital media and cultural heritage. She researches how social media can support, exclude, and contain public discourse, alternative ideas and lived experience, and is also interested in how the use of digital technologies might support creativity, discussion, and the repurposing of expert knowledge in online communities. Lorna's research is also very much in line with what we do at the BIAA, because we are very much focusing on public archaeology and cultural heritage, and we recently launched our digital repository. So we are trying to make these two departments talk to each other. So I'm sure we are going to learn a lot from your lecture. So the title of the talk is What's the Meaning of Stonehenge? An Exploration of Public Perceptions and Public Engagement. As you can imagine, also in Turkey, we are talking about public perception quite a lot these days, because we had the first round of elections and now we are going to have the second round of elections coming up. And I'm not going to, of course, talk about the elections here, but I would like to draw your attention, if you're interested, we have an upcoming lecture on the 1st of June, which is going to talk about the results of the elections. It's going to be a hybrid event, so it's going to be both face-to-face in London and online. And if you're interested, please check the BIA's event webpage. So without any further ado, I'm going to leave the screen to Lorna, and we are very excited to hear the lecture.
Thank you. Can you, if I tell you when, are you all right to manage the slides? Fantastic. So go with slide 1, please. Hello, thank you ever so much for everybody coming to see this. And I apologise in advance if any of you have attended a previous time when I've talked about this research. It's not going to be hugely different, but it will be slightly different. I'm in the middle of finishing this up as a paper, so I hope that it will be published as a referable paper, as we have to do nowadays in the glorious higher education sector in the UK. But I wanted to talk a bit about what this research involves, and we are going to be talking about Stonehenge, but we are going to be talking about Stonehenge from a different angle. So Stonehenge from the perception of people that bother talking about it in public spaces online. And thanks to the almost complete saturation of digital media in the world, participatory media especially, there is a huge amount of digital data that's available to us as researchers that help us understand society, help us understand what it is to be a human actor in a digital world. And digital social science has had an important impact on the sort of methodological approaches to the internet and the resultant digital social phenomena. So we're talking about human interaction, community building, and those kinds of things, practices, communities, what they are, who they are, why they do these things. In terms of archaeology, in recent years, there has been a growth alongside the development of the internet and the saturation of the internet in society. There's been a development of these applications and these types of digital social research methodologies in archaeology. Most importantly, Chiara Bonacci's work on archaeology, nationalism and big data. And I really recommend everybody reading Chiara's work. It's absolutely fantastic and really, really important stuff for digital research in archaeology. However, in terms of what those thoughts, what those data can tell us about people's thoughts and feelings, I think this needs a different approach. And I hope to elaborate further today on this debate of the role of qualitative versus quantitative social research in digital tech, and try and think about the everyday experience of what it is to understand the past in everyday life, in the present, in digital society. And so I'm going to be talking about this using insights from my research on Stonehenge. So it's a project I've talked about for years. I've been doing it, dabbling in it. I've had lots of issues that have come up that have meant that I've had to have some time off work. So I've kept my finger in this pie. So I hope that this pie is now ready to be put in the oven and baked and will be in a journal near you soon. So if we can conceptualize that public archaeology and heritage more broadly can also be about contemporary social practices, we can start to see that data extracted from these social media discourses, these discussions about cultural heritage, archaeological sites, archaeological finds and so on, are actually this area, these communities, these digital spaces are field sites. And in these field sites, we can capture and understand how this heritage-focused social and economic power structures operate. And we can think about the political expediency of these sites, and we can think about what they do, what their work is as a well of symbolic resources drawn on for nationhood identity. And if archaeologists and heritage professionals want to think about the presence of the past within contemporary and social and political discourse, this type of multidisciplinary work, which crosses over the digital humanities, which crosses into social science more broadly, is really useful. And using this type of data, which is taken from social media, and I mean social media more broadly, as in communities, discussions, discursive media, it's possible to observe and to understand human social activity around these subjects. So we can think about monuments, knowledge, understanding, education around archaeology. We can think about what people conceive of past narratives, what they understand about time, how it passes, what communities were involved in the past, how professional archaeology is managed. Sorry, my dog is sitting next to me on the sofa. Shh. Sorry. Shh. Very rude. In a global north, which is atomized by even new fresh claims this week of culture wars, cultural Marxism, fake news, science skepticism, and this terrifying and very real reanimation of race science, there's never really been a more important moment to try and understand what meaning the past means in everyday life, what society ascribes to archaeology and archaeologists, and how they use our professional expert knowledge, how they hear our voices when we engage with the public through media. It's worth mentioning before we go on that social media is messy. It's a messy business. Understanding methodology is really important to understand the limits of this type of research, and I want to be really clear about that. This has limitations, of course, and thinking about moving the methodological emphasis on this work from understanding networks and understanding the networks of communities to understanding individual interactions, people's routines, people's social lives, their socialities. And these concepts enable us to understand how this type of social media ethnography produces ethnographic places that traverse these online, offline contexts, that people visit Stonehenge and they talk about it online. These field sites, the discussions that happen there and the actions that take place as a result of people engaging with this type of online material about the past is really complex, and it's often very collaborative. So it's conversational, it's participatory, so you have to be in it to be part of it. So it excludes people automatically, but it's often very ephemeral. And, with everything that you do with social research, you can never know if this is people's, defined thoughts forever on this subject, whether it was that point in time that they decided to comment. So meaning can change over time. The important part of this data, and the reason I chose this particular topic and method, is that these types of data are also likely to contain truths that are unaffected by the interperson engagement, by reluctance to talk honestly and openly when you're talking to somebody who may be a professional. For example, if you were having a formal interview on a site, or if you were in a focus group, for example, or using any of the other traditional qualitative research methods that involve face-to-face work, people aren't necessarily going to speak their truth. Now, these platforms and their apps, they all have massive challenges for the researcher to access, and that, you know, that's just normal. And lots of papers in the last few years that have dealt with digital social archaeology and heritage, they've used big data approaches. So talking about Chiara's work, which is fantastic, by the way, but you know, big data approaches require technological understanding, they require web scraping, and that they themselves limit the types of material that you can access. As a general, you know, your tame archaeologist doesn't necessarily know how to scrape data, understand how to use Python or R or anything else like that. So it makes that complicated, but accessing information from mobile phone apps is even more complicated. And there are huge ethical issues that go along with all of these types of things. So some of the strategies and the methods that I'm going to be talking about today, I've drawn from the discipline of online ethnography. And ethnography has been defined as thick description, so a methodological approach that specifies contextual information, complex details, structures and meanings. The internet is so embedded in and is within and blended through our everyday lives, our everyday realities, material realities, physical realities, as much as intellectual, as much as digital. So we need to think a little bit beyond these qualitative, quantitative divides and try and think about the fact that the digital world is the world. Excuse me. Could I have slide 2, please? And apologies for my dog in advance. He's very keen on my work, which is nice. So I'm researching why people are interested in Stonehenge. I want to understand what professional archaeological expertise means to people who are outside of the archaeological sector, especially people who rarely encounter academic archaeology. So I'm not talking about people who are particularly necessarily involved in community archaeology groups, or who have, you know, sort of that kind of association or affiliation, although they are what we might call amateurs. And understanding what the wider public might understand that archaeology means, it kind of helps us have better responsive public engagement. We can improve how we create access to archaeology, what stories we tell about archaeology, how we help people access archaeology themselves, how we can support people to co-produce their own versions of the past, and we can have a better understanding of the role that our work, whether that's in cultural heritage or archaeology, and how that work is important to people's ideas of nationality, of nationhood and individual identity. An anthropologist, Jeb Card, has said that archaeology provides not only the symbol of discovery that can overturn the status quo, but by digging into a mythic past, it allows for the discovery of the sacred beyond the mundane. And understanding that intersection of public archaeology and affect is really fascinating to me. Now, there's been, as you can see in the slides, there's been quite a bit of work done on various aspects of Stonehenge over the years. You know, the relationship between the site and alternative groups, so New Age travellers, Druids, people that might be going there to seek spiritual enlightenment and so on, and try to understand what the site means to them. There's been work done on understanding tourism, what tourists expect of the site, visitor attitudes to that. And most recently, Ben Pitcher's book, Back to the Stone Age, which is here, really, really good book. Again, really recommend reading this. It's a very interesting take on things. It's discussed the role of prehistory in the present from the perspective of a sociologist. So somebody has no background or real immersion in sort of our understanding of archaeology as archaeologists. And so there is stuff done, and of course there's plentiful tall tales and conspiracy theories about Stonehenge available online. You know, till you're blue in the face, you could spend years of your life on YouTube or even on TV, Netflix and so on, learning about that Stonehenge was created by
Lorna, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but is there a problem with the microphone? I mean, or are the people touching the microphone, because we hear this?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's much better now. Thank you.
Shall I carry on? Is it, yeah, everybody heard something?
I think it's fine now.
Yeah. So it's relatively easy for a professional archaeologist to understand the latest interpretations of Stonehenge, or anywhere else really, that's written by academics. But there have not been many attempts to understand what the process of archaeological work or the finds or the narratives that have been presented in the media might mean, if anything, to everyday regular people. And that's always seemed to me to be a really big oversight, especially for the archaeology sector and especially for cultural heritage more broadly, because you know, understanding the meaning of these things might help people more generally feel greater value for these things and cherish these things. So could I have next slide, please? So what's the meaning of Stonehenge project? Really has these central research questions. Better audience research is absolutely key to understanding prevailing public attitudes to both the process of archaeological work and the protections that exist in law, in society, and so on, but as well as heritage sites. So without going into too much detail on sort of digital media and contemporary sort of communication and media studies, the disclosure of personal opinion in anonymous spaces online is something that happens and has been researched in other areas of the social sciences, especially things like communication studies and linguistic analysis. So by accessing newspaper article comments, I felt that this would offer access to data that allowed contributors to say whatever they feel about an issue, whether that's something they feel that they should say or not. So this is a place that's generally anonymous and would give people an opportunity to speak freely. And so the data would perhaps reflect better truth, as much as it's relative, about what Stonehenge means. What do they think it's for? Why does it matter to them? Does it matter to them? What subjects do they discuss when they talk about it, when no archaeologists are present and taking notes? I mean, what meaning does Stonehenge have for the everyday person? And how far do these diverge from the traditional narratives that we're presented in books, exhibitions, and so on? And this project gave me a huge variety of digitally produced data to work on, because there are thousands and thousands of comments made by people on newspaper articles. So I gathered these comments together. Today, there's just going to be stuff that's dealt with from newspaper comments, and I'll talk about that on the next slide, if I could have that, please. So active comments on newspapers come from a wide variety of places. Could we skip forward to the next? That's it. And as with all digital discussions, the active contributions come from a wide variety of people. They're not necessarily reflective of specific groups or political views or age or national identity or whatever. And there are multiple motivations for people to post. And people do more than post. They also like, they favorite, they move up, they recommend, they share. And the complications of the discussion of the detail is really quite long drawn out, and I won't go into too much detail here, but that's going to be in the discussion in my publication if it gets to publication. So could we go forward to the next slide, please? So I think it's important at this point again to be clear that, you know, the digital social research follows the activities of the contributor, the social media user, who is a, or hopefully, rounded dynamic being who deserves to be treated ethically, as well as being treated as a form and source of data. So I could have spent quite a lot of time looking at the usernames and the origins and trying to work out who these people are commenting and where they're from. But apart from this screenshot, the data has been anonymized as far as possible. So the data was collected between 2016 and 2020. I used a database of articles, newspaper articles called Nexus, which is available through most academic libraries. It showed that access was difficult to the Telegraph and Times and other paid world newspapers. So this is basically data that's been taken from the UK. There were, at the end of that, over that period of time, 43 news articles with comments. 26 came from the Daily Mail, 8 from the Independent, 5 from the Sun and 4 from the Guardian. As 2020 onwards has happened, there has been a huge increase in the number of articles about Stonehenge, which won't appear in this talk today, but I will say for another time. And a lot more information has been published in rather more left-leaning newspapers like the Independent and the Guardian in that period of time, with a lot more comments on them. So this data is a particular snapshot in time. And obviously this is heavily weighted to right-wing newspapers. Could I go to the next slide, please? So every year in newspapers globally, there is roughly 1,500 articles about Stonehenge specifically published during that period of time, 2016 to 2020. I narrowed the field down and chose just the information that was published in UK national newspapers. Nexus gives you a link to the newspaper article. I checked the newspaper articles and only the ones with comments were left. So there were, as I said, 46 newspaper articles. And so that was around several thousand words of material about these things. Now, these newspaper topics were fell into a sort of a top level sift of thematic arrangement at the beginning of this research. So there were newspaper topics, newspaper articles about new discoveries, new research, often quoting academics. There was speculative articles which were discussing why the site existed, how it had been built, for example, what people were doing there, what people ate there. There was a lot of all people have been to Stonehenge. So, you know, Barack Obama visited Stonehenge famously. So whenever anybody visited Stonehenge, the Daily Mail would post an article about it. And every year at summer and winter solstice, like the seasons, there was a Daily Mail article, and other newspapers published an article about the solstice celebrations. And we'll talk more about that in a second. And of course, there was a discussion that started to increase in 2020 onwards about the tunnel. And so that sort of has dominated the data from 2020 onwards. Could I have the next slide, please? I want to talk a bit about methodology. This is the point at which everybody probably will fall asleep. So take this as a quick nap. I'm a devout methodological pragmatist, and I think that, you know, when you're working with digital data, it is so difficult to grasp. It changes. People have different motivations for using it. I tend to use thematic analysis, which is based on a form of grounded theory, and it's grounded theory is a qualitative and flexible research methodology. It's a method of inquiry, but it also is a product of that inquiry. So theory is not discovered. It allows observation of social actions, social attitudes, and participation, and you can reflect on iteratively through your own particular lens and acknowledging that. It's really useful when you're trying to explain a process, not when you're trying to test or verify hypotheses. And you code the data, so you're constantly coding data, and by coding data I mean you're adding themes to them, that you're allocating themes, you're comparing the themes. You sit in and with your data. Codes become categories, these become themes, and these become concepts. So eventually you come out with a nice theoretical understanding of what your data sets say to you. And this gives you, this methodological flexibility gives you lots of room to maneuver, to understand and observe and explain how collective and individuals, actors operate within these social media systems. And I really like using this for qualitative data work, and this works especially well for social media. They're like an unfolding iterative system. You can take in lots and lots of other details. They interconnect. You can see recurrent elements. You can see in the directional flow of arrows on the screen that there is this cycle of code, think, reflect, repeat. And I really like this process. It's really shameful, given that I teach digital humanities, that I actually print out all of my data and annotate it by hand with a pen. It's 2023 and I will not let go of that pen. If anybody's interested in this method, I've actually used this grounded theory method to sensitize in preparation to topic modeling, using data taken from Reddit and Twitter for a publication that came out in March in Social Science and Medicine with my colleague at Umeå University in Sweden. So yeah, this is a really good way of sensitizing, qualitative sensitization for people that are doing big data research. Anyway, beyond method. So what was the results of all of this method? If I could have the next slide, please. I'm going to go through some emergent themes, and this is the results of the coding. So this is the results of not just allocating coding, but thematic analysis. This is the distilled presentation of this data. So there were many comments about the analysis of Stonehenge. Stonehenge does not need academic analysis. It's just common sense. You know, people were doing various things in history using their common sense. It demonstrates that people have a wide variety of interpretations, both based on their own experience of life, perhaps doing activities like moving things around, or perhaps they're civil engineers. And they suggested why things were done, why this place might have been created, what people living there did and what they ate, consistently pitched as common sense, using this experience, this present day experience, daily experience. They could identify with the past in this. They were interested in making comparisons with their own lives that weren't necessarily always accurate, but were practical, and certainly were, you know, warmly welcomed by other discussants in these conversations. However, this call for common sense of the activity interpretations and so on around Stonehenge is frequently used as a device to denigrate experts. And it's used as a device to denigrate the experts reported in the articles themselves. And it's this lack of common sense is seen as a failing of the education system, or an indulgence on the part of the academics or the university system more broadly. So they're seen as people utterly lacking in common sense. It's seen as any interventions at Stonehenge archaeologically are seen as a waste of taxpayers' money. And academics are seen to be avoiding proper jobs. Very interesting. I mean, bearing in mind that most of these, or the majority of these comments are drawn from the Daily Mail, these sentiments aren't perhaps a surprise. In the discussions coded as common sense, the real reason for the construction of Stonehenge is not always linked to anything that modern archaeologists or heritage organisations might think about the site at all. And sometimes they're often discussed in terms of their mathematical or their astronomical significance, which of course give scientific explanations that are probably wrong, but they're consistent and they're inflexible and they're scientific, and they're perhaps easier to understand and accept for the average person, rather than the messy complexity of a really long temporal engagement between social, cultural and resource-based engagements with the site that took place a very long time ago and are being discussed in the present. Could I have the next slide, please? Anti-expert sentiment is expressed all over these newspaper discussions, both right-wing and left-wing papers. Archaeologists are given a really bad rap by the commentators. Archaeologists are generally represented to be male. They're generally represented as being unworldly theorists who've got very little understanding of real life, again, reflecting back on what I said previously about common sense. They are guessing rather than applying their knowledge and expertise. And this is really apparent, again, in the Daily Mail, where archaeologists are seen to be some kind of tweedy chancers. They're wasting their time, they're wasting their country's money, and they create these endless projects basically to give themselves a real job, or at least prevent themselves finding a real job. And it's interesting to see how this theme that emerged from the data of sentiment, this sentiment that emerges from the data, collapses into this concept of disappointment, as expert organisations like English Heritage are often represented as greedy and mismanaging, rather than being protective bodies that work on behalf of the nation. Could I have the next slide, please? Another theme that emerges from the data is that Stonehenge as a place to visit as a tourist destination is frequently labelled as a disappointment, or it's not as expected. And the size and the location of the site is almost always seen to be different from how it's been presented in media, in a picture or so on. So there's a discrepancy between the size of the site and its actual importance. And part of the issue of this access is the fact that you have to pay when you get there to visit. And the discrepancy between the size, what it looks like in real life, and an overinflation of the site's importance in archaeological interpretation from an older generation's school curriculum. So I think that's really important to recognise, that this site has been superlativized, if that's a word, in the curriculums of the youth of some of the boomer generation, to a point where it's really difficult for them to adjust. And the narratives that are provided in museums today, or even used to create national identities today, reflect that very early inculcation into the idea that Stonehenge was the epitome of English achievement. If I could have the next slide, please. Lots of people were concerned that people didn't know the truth, that Stonehenge is in fact fake. But the restoration of Stonehenge is well known, it's well documented, it's happened at a number of points in time throughout history, from the 1880s onwards. And all of these are available, all of the photographs about this, or at least the information and photographs about this most recently, they've been available on the English Heritage website, and there have been TV programmes that have discussed this very thing. So the data showed that there's this really commonly held belief that Stonehenge is made up, that they're fake, that they are replicas, that in fact what you see is not stone, it's possibly foam sprayed to make look like stone, or they're reimagined, created in the 20th century by English Heritage. And this means that there's a great deal of distrust that's expressed in this data, and the claims that this site is not authentic and is therefore a rip-off tourist destination is very important to understand, and it's used as an opportunity. Again, the fakeness feeds into the idea of Stonehenge as a place where expertise is there, but expertise is being used to draw the wool over people's eyes. Could I have the next slide, please? This leads to the next emergent theme, which is that access to the stones is denied to the public, which it didn't used to be in the past, and that the use of fencing and the visitor centre and the fact that you have to pay to access it has somehow reduced the authenticity of the experience of the site. And there is a lot of sentiment that is expressed in these data from older people who seem to be older, who are reminiscing about their childhoods, about being able to run through the stones, about stopping on the road on the way down to the West Country or wherever to have picnics. And this concept is tied up very much with the perception of greed and the prioritisation of income on behalf of English Heritage. And the National Trust is mentioned, quote, the overpriced tripper trap. And many people are mourning the influx of tourists to the area. Presumably these people are locals, but talking about this place not being theirs anymore. Visitors who do come are talking about the fact that they're not able to access because of so many foreign visitors. So there's an element of anti-immigration almost. And it's nostalgia. There's a very strong feeling of nostalgia and reminiscence. And there's a sadness attached to this denial of access, that access has been lost, something else has been lost about being British, that there is an anger expressed towards English Heritage and towards what's perceived as a preference for paying tourists, and especially paying tourists from overseas. Can I have the next slide, please? One of the, as I said at the beginning, one of the growing topics is the tunnel. And I will not speak a lot about this because I want to save that for the future, but the emergent themes from this that were about the tunnel were, most people didn't really believe that it would happen, and the overarching feeling in the below the line comments was that it's just a piece of planning that's happened, it won't ever come into being, and that the traffic issues were blamed on tourists, rubbernecking tourists. So people that were slowing down to look by, but there was nothing that was going to be done, and that that this tunnel was a dream and it was never going to happen. A small number of the comments saw this as the potential to have a huge impact on our common heritage. So understanding this as being globally impactful, and as a World Heritage Site, many saw this road, this tunnel, these proposals as desecration, which is very strong language. Now, in terms of understanding complexities around the archaeological involvement in this, there has been quite a lot of discussion on both sides of the argument for and against archaeological intervention here, and I don't want to become involved in that at this point. But I will say that in the under the below the line comments, archaeologists are generally seen alongside ecologists, so you will always see comments that are about tunnel, and then people talking about newts, great crested newts. that archaeologists and archaeological work is a barrier to progress. It's delaying the road. So rather than the archaeological intervention being a desecration, the actual archaeological work is in fact holding things up. So you can see that this is incredibly complicated data. It really does need a lot of unpicking. Can I have the next slide, please? It's inevitable that I have to have a spinal tap image here, because Stonehenge is a device that's been used for comedy for decades, and it has a really long data set. And so this data has comedy in it, and it's possibly the worst collection of archaeological dad jokes I've ever had to read in the name of research. And all aspects of archaeological work, from the interpretation, the imaginary pasts, the present issues of tourism, the road, the tunnel, the solstice, the hippies, you know, they're all butts of humour. And people inevitably will make jokes about the construction of the site, its mysterious function, and this may be a device. My reflections on this are that this joking, this use of Stonehenge as a focus for humour is in fact a device for dismissing the unknowable. That it's something that people don't understand, so the tendency is to make light of something that isn't quite knowable or easy to understand. And it could just be that the comment sections are temporary communities. They come together and move apart, but the mechanism in online communities is often based on shared sense of humor. So jokes are things that people will comment on or they will like. So it's a way of attracting attention. It's a way of operating and encouraging interaction within that temporary group. So humour in archaeology is a really interesting direction of travel, because I haven't seen a huge amount of work done in that area. Could I have the next slide, please? The humour stands in contrast to comments and themes that emerge from the comments and the data set about New Age Stonehenge. And Stonehenge is open to visitors at the solstices, and the solstice celebrations and their visitors, again, as I said before, they're inevitably reported every year, and they inevitably contain a photograph of attractive women enjoying the celebrations in a state of undress in the summer, and of a group of druids mid-ceremony. There are free activities at the site. They're inevitably dirty hippies or idiot druids that are discussed. So they're discussed as having no right to be there. There's a surprising amount of venom directed at the use of this space for modern ritual activity. And so the attitudes to visitors at these particular periods changes in the discussions. Participants are universally referred to as this jobless, feckless mass. These are people who are on benefits. These are not taxpayers. They're, you know, socialist layabouts, devil worshippers, and they're always unwashed. I look back, I have some data from 2014 and 15 as well, and these solstice related discussions are the same then, and they are the same in the data from 2020 to 2023, or 2022, solstice 2022. So conceptually, these are identical. And there is a contradiction in who has the valid right to interact with the site. And the language used, this soap dodging, this bone idol layabouts, are an interesting contrast to these bikini-clad women and the festival-style vibe of these photographs. And these attitudes seem to arrive without a lot of consideration for the contemporary social and economic circumstances in this country. And I don't really know of many people on benefits who would be allowed to party in Wiltshire for a few days without being fined by the Department of Work and Pensions. And it doesn't reflect the demise of the New Age traveller community, thanks to recent government legislation that's outlawed gypsy, traveller and other moving communities from parking up. And it's certainly the Weekend Observer reading #festival middle classes who seem to be the growing audience for these types of encounters with solstice events. So it's interesting that there is this hatred towards the people that are using it for this ritual activity. And it's really interesting to think that it's still seen as a sacred place by those who also comment on this, by those who profess that they belong to another religion. So people who profess Christianity are still seeing this as a sacred place in the present, but the people using it in the present for ritual activity, for spiritual activity, are people that shouldn't be there. So it's incredibly complicated. But it's interesting when we consider what Jeb Card says. It describes the professional archaeologist's tactic of ignoring the esoteric underpinnings of popular understandings of archaeology as based on a fundamentally flawed assumption that people respect the authority of archaeologists. So when it comes to Stonehenge at solstice, there are tensions between an ongoing past and present paganness and the archaeological interpretations of the relevance of solstice, but also generally festival, generally enjoyment, generally Instagram. I mean, perhaps who really cares? You know, perhaps it is just all really Instagrammable. Could I have the next slide, please? Stonehenge seems to represent a place that firmly belongs to the present population of England, as opposed to any of the other developed countries. In this data, it's seen that it belongs very specifically to the south of England rather than country as a whole. And the attachment to ideas of ancestry has a special importance during discussions of the origin of the stones themselves, the types of the activities that took place in prehistory at the site, or the importance of the site in the present day, for example, during the discussions of the tunnel. Ownership of the site of the people conceived as ancestors has been used as a device in the discussions, as a device to support British and English exceptionalism, and as a way of harnessing Stonehenge as a place and as an activity to Brexit. So fixing Stonehenge to Brexit. It's used as a way of demonstrating either British superiority, English superiority, exceptionalism and individualism, or using various prehistoric relationships with the continent that can be seen in the archaeological data from the site and its surrounding area to support discussions of modern Britain's ancient Europeanness. So there is an incredible tension between these two ideas about Stonehenge, and I really recommend everybody reads the recent work of Gordon Berkeley and Kenny Brophy here. I've got to quote them directly as I can't put it better myself. This idea of a Neolithic Brexit has been used, although not by the archaeologists who unwisely coined the term, to support the separation of Britain from the European Union and uphold anti-immigration and racist beliefs. But of course, Stonehenge has nothing to do with the 21st century British identity politics, and it can't shed light on debates about post-Brexit Britain, immigration, what it is to be British, or the origins of Britishness, whatever that means. The nationalist appropriation of ancient sites such as Stonehenge is deeply problematic. It can encourage distorted interpretations of research, spark sensationalized media spin, and reinforce harmful prejudices. Ben Pitcher's recent book, this Back to the Stone Age, Race and Prehistory in Contemporary Culture, is also an important development in understanding how these origin myths affect our understandings of Stonehenge and other historic places. Can I have the next slide, please? Stonehenge is a mystery, and Stonehenge and its connection to pseudo-archaeologists was not an unexpected concept. I had read before that this might happen. And it definitely happened in the data. There is definitely an association between mystery and Stonehenge, but it didn't happen as frequently as I'd expected. I did expect to see more of these ideas about alternative theories, about mysterious circumstances for the creation of the site in the data, especially given the majority of the below the line comments came from the Daily Mail. But these types of mysteriousness were not discussed that widely. Where they were discussed, again, you see the interactions of an online community that had developed around a discussion. The ones expressly mentioning aliens were routinely mocked by other comments. And the ones that offered what we might consider to be pseudo-archaeological interpretations didn't really lead to long, lengthy discussions with other commenters, and they were routinely ignored. In terms of mystery, people were much more open to discussing the alternative ideas that were presented through the common sense idea of mathematical or astronomical ideas for what it could have been used for. So these were repeated sparingly in the comments. There's a lot of discussion about the impenetrability of the mystery around Stonehenge and its innate fundamental unknowability, or absolute disinterest. No one knows, no one cares, why should we? Joseph Laycock has argued that the goal of pseudo-archaeology is not really to provide better interpretations of archaeological evidence, and often these alternative explanations of the past represent the legitimization of particular worldviews and institutions. Even more often, pseudo-archaeological discourse satisfies its audience because it produces, not because it produces certainty, but because it produces uncertainty. And that the function of pseudo-archaeology is to undermine the findings of professional archaeology to make room for this mystery. And I think this idea of mystery is really important. Ben Pitcher notes in his work that the idea is the ideas of forbidden knowledge, that the past contains forbidden knowledge, is one that fits nicely into a nation experiencing complex external, internal, political and economic crises alongside a crisis of national identity. Religious or at least spiritual concerns are not normally part of archaeological scholarship. The sacred or the esoteric are not normally part of mainstream archaeological discourse, and certainly not in some aspects of British public archaeology. In recent years, public archaeologists have tended to overlook the possibilities that have been presented by understanding this significance of spiritual, mystery-driven encounters with archaeological sites and monuments in Western Europe, or not Northwestern Europe at least. And this is an area with a small handful of active researchers at the moment, and is one with great potential. Laycock has argued that mainstream archaeology has become a major purveyor of disenchantment, in the sense that it pushes back the historical record further, denuding the past of mysterious forces and dispelling the enchantment of ancient sites. There's a real sense in this below the line data that the mysteries of Stonehenge are a reflection of the need for what Sarah Perry talks about, this re-enchantment and the rebellion against the authority of scientific discourse. But it's equally constrained by an equal force of a need for common sense, this need for something to be provable. So it's disenchantment rather than a belief in mysterious forces. The historian of religion, Mercier Eliade, has identified this as a nostalgia, a type of nostalgia, a nostalgia for a sacred time that existed in the past, a time that he calls the dead time, the time that crushes and kills. This modern world of mainstream Western culture, this modern world of, dare I say, Western late stage capitalism. So observing these online discussions is perhaps positive. It offers an opportunity for further engagement with these complex interpretations of what the site is, what it does, why people enjoy going there, why they don't, what it means to everyday life, and it helps us to better explain interpretations made by experts as best evidence at the time. These expert-led narratives are based on the best evidence available at the time. And Laycock says that while the media convey pseudo-archaeological ideas to the public, sometimes present these ideas in a scientific register, the real purpose is to sever the audience's sense of bondage to the known, to make room for re-enchantment and subjective life. The hard work of professional archaeologists is unfortunately a bystander in this project. Situating mystery within a framework of public archaeology rather than the dismissal of these emotional and spiritual affective encounters with prehistory could offer us new insights into the role of the past in everyday life. There is much more work to be done in this area. The emergent concepts I've mentioned today are important to understand the relevance of the archaeological site of Stonehenge for the wider public, and what archaeology and archaeologists more broadly represent to the average person outside our own echo chambers. There's a lot of information here. There's lots of information that I hope to publish, but there's a lot more work to do. There's huge potential in this data, and data similar, to explore better how to respond to people's needs from the past, needs from heritage itself, if in fact there is anything that's needed at all. Prehistory, and by extension Stonehenge, is a source of endless speculation. It's ultimately unknowable, and so it becomes a mirror on the present, and it's often invoked as an answer to the problems of the present, be that Brexit, immigration, national identity, societal ills, or even communal enjoyment. The stories about the past that dominate the headlines, be they the gatherings of the great unwashed at solstice celebrations or projecting Queen Elizabeth onto the stones, only happen because we as archaeologists, as historians, as journalists, have allowed them to dominate for decades, until the site becomes the entirety of the prehistoric past and the distillation of the complexity and nuance of the archaeological process. When there are thousands of other stories at archaeological sites in the UK that could hold their own against Wiltshire, but are drowned out. But we'll always get the Stonehenge we deserve. Could I have the next slide, please? Sorry, could you go forward to the next slide? Should have gone, that was the next slide. Just to finish up, I've written a comic about this work, which you are very welcome to go and look at. One of the reasons why I chose to publish this work initially as a comic was because I felt that, one, I wanted this information to be accessible to the public if they wanted to find out what academics were doing, and two, I thought it was a light-hearted way to approach data that would receive quite a lot of negative comment. So if I could have the next slide. This is available on appropriations, a journal for creative engagement with history and archaeology. It's available online. It's open source, CC license. So you're very welcome to use any of the images you want in any of your presentations and so on in future. It has 8 pages, I think, and I'm very pleased with it. But I would be interested to hear back from you if you read it, if you think this is a good way to present academic research. Could I go to the next one, please? So my work continues on this as and when I can. I'm very interested in discussing this as much as possible, so I hope you'll have some nice questions for me. But thank you very much for listening to my adventures with Stonehenge, and long may they continue.
Thank you very much, Lorna. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Fantastic, really. Thank you so much for sharing all the work. And I was thinking that what do you do with all the negative comments that you keep receiving? And then what you did in the end was, I think, a brilliant way of maybe also. Another question I had, like, how do you feel when you read all the comments? Isn't it a bit too much at some point? But I see that the comic is like a way of dealing with that, but correct me if I'm wrong.
It's always difficult being interdisciplinary. So I think that archaeologists will see my work as not being archaeological, and digital media, people will see it as not being digital media. So I sit between two things, but it's read the comic and and then we can have discussions. I don't know. I'm open to questions.
So there is one question in the Q&A box, and I think I did catch some questions in the chat. I'm going to go back and see them. But the Q&A, yes, has any research into the public perception of archaeology and archaeologists been undertaken? Are we all tweeted chances?
There has been very important work done by Cornelius Holthoff, who wrote a book called Archaeology as a Brand. It's really good reading. It's 2006, I think, but well worth reading. And he does talk a lot about how archaeologists are perceived, about clothing, about archaeology jumpers, about trowels, about all of these signs and signifiers, the semiotics of archaeology and archaeologists.
We also did a public opinion poll here in Turkey in 2018, investigating the perception of archaeology and archaeologists in Turkey, of course. There are very similar results, but there are also some differences, but we can have a chat about that. So another great talk, thanks from Henry Chapman. Do audiences ever talk about Stonehenge as a landscape rather than just a stone circle?
Almost never. In the data that I had, bear in mind the data that is from 2020 onwards, we'll be talking about the impact of the tunnel on the landscape. So that data has changed. But in the data from 2014 onwards, no, it's a stone circle. It's not a landscape.
A couple of questions from the chat box. Richard Hughes asks, how much influence does the newspaper editor have as to do what is published and especially what is not? Seems to me there are vested interests in selling the papers with not much interest in the topic. Thus, an article appears one day and is forgotten the next. Obviously, you don't forget it, but readers do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, sorry, my dog has decided to come up. Absolutely. There is, Stonehenge sells. I think in 2021 and 2022, there was something like one article on Stonehenge every month. This is churning out, and it always hits the commenters love it. It's catnip to these people. But yes, it's done. Although I will say, since Maeve Kennedy left writing for The Guardian as much, the Daily Mail's archaeological coverage is okay, it's good, and it's certainly more comprehensive than any other newspaper in the UK.
Another one in the Q&A box. This is from Hakan Tarhan from the BIAA. Thank you very much for your talk, Dr. Richardson. I wanted to ask you about the online ethnography methodology. What are the drawbacks of not actually knowing personal data demographics of the people compared to on-site ethnography in terms of understanding people's perceptions?
A good question. It's really, the only problem is that it's no different from doing big data research, because you don't know who's made those comments either. But when you're doing qualitative research, you're much closer to the data. You're not reading distantly. I don't personally think that there's a drawback. I think that the reception of the findings there may be questions about the methodology, but I think if you have a robust reason for anonymizing this data, then that's fine. You can't speculate on people's levels of education, for example, or people's locations and occupations. You can draw presumptions, but you have to make that clear in your research findings. I know that Hakan and I were supposed to have a conversation, which I'm sorry we didn't get to have, but we can have it soon if that's all right. We can go into more detail about this methodology, because I know that he's been keen to pick my brain on this matter. So I'm sorry.
Thank you so much. Two more questions in the chat box. Elizabeth Healy says, very, very interesting talk, thanks. The comments that you presented to us are negative. Are there some positive ones too?
there are positive ones. I think in all of these topics and all of these themes, there are good sides to it, and I think it's generally presented as a negative to comment. You would only comment if you're feeling negative towards it, or at least neutral. But there are discussions that happen around this issue of Stonehenge in whatever theme that are positive. People support the site, but they're disappointed in the fact they have to pay, or they can't visit, or they enjoy being part of this online community, temporarily grouping in an online community about Stonehenge, because they can have an opinion. So it's not all negative, but it's not necessarily, Stonehenge is wonderful. Yeah.
One last question from Haldun Solmaster from Ankara. What is the connection, if any, between the Stonehenge and the other megalithic structures such as Göbekli Tepe in Turkey? Maybe we can refer to this in terms of your research and say, if anything, if any comparisons do you see in the public perception comparing these structures?
I've only seen a couple of comments about specifically Göbekli Tepe that were made, and it was along the lines of similar sort of national identity attachments to these sites. But this is data that's taken from UK newspapers. But I do know that there are people working on this, trying to understand similar things from Turkish newspaper articles. So I have seen a paper. In fact, it's going to come, if I can plug, the future Routledge Handbook of Archaeology in the Media that should be coming out sometime by Christmas. There is a paper in there about this exact subject, so watch that space.
Thank you for flagging that for us. And one last comment I'm going to read. It's not a question, it's a comment from Julian Bennett. I think it's worth pointing out that if you don't know the importance of Stonehenge in its prehistoric context, then it's a depressing road to drive there and not actually that impressive until you get on the site. So that is also, I agree that it's an important comment. We have a lot of comments in the chat box. I'm going to email these to you so you can have a look.
Thank you.
And
I'm sorry I have to escape early, but I've got a Girl Guide treat.
Yes, I know. I was keeping an eye on the watch. So yes, enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you everyone for your excellent comments and questions and for your participation. We hope to see you again in another BIAA online lecture. And thank you so much, Lorna. Take care.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.